welcome back to the Storytellers series. I have with me today Dr. Mandeep Rai. Mandeep is a global authority on values. She works with companies, institutions, and individuals around the world. Mandeep has traveled to more than 150 countries and has been a journalist for the BBC World Service and Reuters, amongst others. Mandeep began her career as a private banker at JP Morgan and later worked for the United Nations, the European Commission, and grassroots NGOs before setting up the United Arab Emirates' first media venture capital fund. Mandeep studied philosophy, politics, and economics, earned an MSc in International Development from the London School of Economics, and completed an MBA at London Business School, with a year at Harvard Business School and MIT. She holds a PhD in global values. Mandeep has been named a 2021 top thinker to watch from Thinkers 50, and she is the author of The Values Compass: What 101 Countries Teach Us About Purpose, Life, and Leadership. Her book is an international bestseller with the Wall Street Journal and the Sunday Times, and the book is on the Business Book Awards shortlist for 2021. Welcome, Mandeep, and thank you for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Tanya. We go such a long way. I think we have a 20-year history, so there's no way in the world that I wouldn't be joining you anywhere.
So as you know, this is a series on storytelling, and I'm particularly interested in female-identified storytellers and their experience. So the first question I had for you, Mandeep, is how did storytelling become a part of your life, and in what ways is it still a part of your life?
I think I'm not alone when I say that we are made up of stories. The stories that we hear from our parents about what our grandparents did, or what our great-grandparents did, or what our lineage is, or where we come from. And the word for story in Gurmukhi is Sakya. So the whole of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, which are the Sikh spiritual scriptures, are written in verse. But there are also story after story after story after story in which the whole narrative is told. And it's the same in the Mahabharata, in the Bhagavad Gita, in the Bible, in the Quran, in the Vedas. Now, these are huge texts upon which people are living their lives. And then there are the stories of what we think about ourselves, the stories of what we make of the world around us, the story of history, the story of geography, the story of the society around us, or even our own psychology. So I feel that the power of storytelling, or indeed the importance of stories, is paramount. It is fundamental. It's like our foundation. And then there are the stories that we tell ourselves, which are perhaps the most important, and the stories that if we told the story slightly differently, we would think about everything very differently, i.e. the stories that reframe. So they've been important in my life from the get-go. Equally, they are perhaps becoming more and more and more important as I begin to realize their power, utilize their power, hear their power, and as I am affected by their power. I guess in some ways I have become a storyteller. And actually within the book, there's a chapter on Ireland around storytelling. Now, values are what we're built upon, what we're built by, and it's also what we find to be most important. For a country like Ireland to put storytelling right in its core, in its crux, in its DNA, just shows how important storytelling is. The fact that it's one of these values, one of these 101 values, as is gratitude, as is compassion, as is love. I think to really answer your question, I would say story is a value that I've highlighted for that very reason, because it is of such paramount importance.
As a professional journalist and as an author, one would see that you're a storyteller, and there's probably some element of storytelling in raising funds for a venture capital fund. But to take it away from professional realms and into your more intimate life, in what ways do you feel you use storytelling as a mother, as a wife, as a sister?
I can tell you that as a mother, since you started there, I use storytelling all the time. I think it's one of the greatest bonds between me and my children, especially my younger child, who still says to me, Mama, tell me a story. And he doesn't mean a fictitious story. He means who, like yesterday, I came to the dinner table and we had this ritual where we say one positive thing that happened in the day. I use stories to convey ideas, to convey a lesson or a teaching, to convey what I learned, maybe where I slipped up and what happened as a result. I've noticed that my children also have started to use stories, even in the way that they tell their exam results to me. So, this game of stories is it is how we speak all the time without realizing it.
Both professionally and personally, there are stories that make up your life and that you tell. What do you think are the common elements of storytelling that runs both through your professional and personal life?
My professional and personal life have become quite intertwined. So these stories that are in the book, if I take you through the book, each and look, the page I just happened to open on is about family from the Philippines, and you can see a picture of my son and I. It's an extremely personal account throughout. It's 102 actually little stories of real life experiences that I've encountered. So that veneer between personal and professional has somewhat disappeared or disintegrated. To begin with, it did make me feel really uncomfortable because they might not be appreciated. When you give birth to a child, people are just obliged to say that child's cute. It's just a truth in the world that you've all decided that that's how you react to children. When you share a story, especially when you write a book, no one's obliged to do that. And in fact, probably the other way around, I remember when the publisher said, Mandeep, at first they said, try and get some people to review the book, as in, whoever reads the book, friends, family, wherever you know it's going, please ask them to report back and write a review. And very quickly they said, there's too many good reviews. We're going to send this out to independent reviewers. And I remember freezing and saying, really, do we have to? Are you sure? Because I'm going to be judged upon my story and judged by someone who's paid to be critical and paid to be to see the faults and show you where it isn't quite good enough or where it could be better. And so immediately you feel as though your stories are being judged. But it's the way of the world. We're always being judged. We just sometimes people don't tell us, but the industry I'm in, people tell you. I'm not framing anything as right or wrong, good or bad, should or shouldn't. If what's important to you is excellence or teamwork or competitiveness, that is not higher or lower or better or worse than another bunch of values like gratitude. What I'm highlighting is simply that actually I'm highlighting some form of equity, that it really doesn't matter what you're prizing. The importance is almost prizing it so it brings you ease and happiness and joy, contentment, satisfaction, fulfillment in your life. So I think the storytelling element, you're spot on. I was really pushed to make sure that there was a narrative, that there was an arc connecting each and every one of these 101, 102 stories within the book. But that moral part, even though sometimes people associate values with ethics and ethics with morality, I have deliberately not deliberately tried not to take those steps or have not taken those steps, because who am I to judge what's good or what's bad? And even more importantly, I remember a good story about the farmer who, I think he's a farmer, whose son breaks his leg. I can't remember how the story goes, but I can tell you vaguely that when his neighbors came to his house and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear about your son." And the farmer said, "Well, you don't need to be sorry. We don't know if it's good or bad. It's too soon to tell, or I don't know." And then when the army came to recruit all the young people in the village and his son was not recruited, the villagers came around and said, "Oh, wow, how lucky you are. Your son hasn't been recruited." And again, the farmer said, "Good or bad, it's too soon to tell. I'm not the judge." And this happened repeatedly where things would happen. And in my life too, I try not to, if I don't get the job, if I do get the job, if something I wanted happens, or if it doesn't happen, at what point do you know if it's good or bad? Sometimes you never know. And sometimes you think it went one way, but really it went another. Who are we to judge? I think I would even take that a step further and say it's not even who are we to judge. It's like we can't judge because we actually don't know. Whatever's happening could also be simply about how are we taking it and how are we now going to utilize it so that it's of benefit, so that there's some growth from it, so that we're a more evolved soul. So that's in our hands. There is no good or bad. We don't need to frame it as that at all.
Right. That's the whole process of meaning making in our lives. And that's, when we read a story, we're looking for the meaning of the story. And that's the meaning making of our own life story. Now, you've been telling stories all your life. What do you think is the special contribution or maybe the limitations of being a female identified storyteller in the world?
That's very interesting. Limitation, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to call it a limitation. Even if I told you the story of being an athlete and being vis-a-vis being a mother, I run a marathon, it takes a day. And although it takes a bit of time, some hours every single week in your training of it, really you are not involved in that marathon day in, day out. The way you are in pregnancy. 286 days. How many days was I in that process? More than anyone is during a triathlon, more than anyone is in any type of sport or athletics. That test of endurance, that test of who you are, really, there's no comparison to what a woman or mother goes through. And yet, how often or when is that story ever framed in that way? When is the story of women ever portrayed with justice such that you have a sense of how much they do, how much they're doing within the house, how much they're doing outside of the house, what they're doing to make sure that their family is okay, that they're being as you said very clearly right at the beginning of this interview, to be a good mother, to be a good daughter, to be a good sister, to be a good neighbor, to be a good wife, to be like, women put a lot of pressure on themselves to be a good everything. But are those stories ever told really in the kind of gravitas or weight in which we give to, say, entrepreneurs, or in which we give to CEOs, or in which we give to any of the other kind of more paid professions? And I guess to take it even a step further, when I think about the really demeaning stories that are told about women, I can tell you so many throughout history. They say that this pandemic has hit women much harder than men, to the point that maybe 37 years of progress has been reversed of the last 150 years that we've been really kind of trying to push forward. It has really knocked many, many women in terms of their livelihood, in terms of, where they are and what's available to them and the opportunities that they have. So I think that the narrative around women is definitely one that almost needs a complete injection. It needs a blast. It needs to be directed upwards so that it's really lit up and we can see these narratives for who and what they are, rather than them being very gently written out of history. Women are what are holding up half the sky. But is that narrative told? No. When I first answered this question, I said I'm not going to say that I've been held back because I'm a woman. Why? Because I think me doing that is not going to serve anyone, not myself, not you, or anyone else. I've been really fortunate that the Values Compass has been shortlisted this year, as you said, for the Business Book of the Year in the Diversity, Equality, Inclusion category. And that's really important because I'm proud of the fact that I'm female, that I'm of the background that I am, which is of Indian heritage, of the fact that I have a very global perspective and have deliberately made this completely international, but in a way that whether I'm talking about Malawi or Madagascar or Mozambique, or they all happen to be African countries. I'm trying to think of an M country, Mongolia, Montenegro.
There we go.
I've deliberately made sure that each and every quality, just as I said, each and every value, there's no good or bad, there's no higher or lower, there's no one is more important than another. It's just that diversity counts. We're all equal, we just happen to be different. And so, yes, I'm different because I'm a female, but my story is just as valid, just as all those other countries are equally valid as each other, and all of their narratives are equally valid and helpful in our lives. For you, looking at respect from Japan, or devotion from Tibet, or pragmatism from China, or commitment from Iran, to see how those values, the value of education from Palestine, or the value of chutzpah from Israel, how each of those values, when applied to your life, what would it give you? How would it enhance your life? And do you wish to make that a priority? One is not better than another. It's simply a choice of yours.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit about how the book came into being.
Well, Tanya, I feel as though I must bring it back to you and I. This is no ordinary interview. I'm not being interviewed by someone I've never met. I'm being interviewed by someone with whom I used to study at the London School of Economics on an international development program, on a master's program. I think all of that is relevant to the seeds or the beginnings of this book. We were taught right from the get-go of the importance to look outside to then understand the inside. And you can tell by what we're both doing and the stories that we're both telling that outward reflection helped our inner reflection. And I think that the professors that we had, the books that we were encouraged to read, and then the wider reading that we then went on to do, so that we weren't regurgitating the same essays and we weren't having just one worldview, or we weren't just thinking about it in one different perspective. And also because the LSE has such a mixed history and so many different characters that have played a part in this institution and who are really influencing the world. They were influencing the world then, and they're influencing the world now. For example, we have a professor, Sir Christopher Pissarides. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics and is still teaching at the LSE. We had Professor Desai. We had Lord Desai, in fact. We had just the other Nobel Prize winner, Amartya Sen. We had incredible people teach us and give us all these different lenses and ways to look at the world. And it's really hard. Well, you go there to be shaped by all of that, but more importantly, you go there to develop your own critical thinking. And on top of that, we then used to make the trek from the LSE to the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, and attend lectures by Mushtaq Khan, and attend lectures about, the Middle East and the conflict in the Middle East, and could there be peace in the Middle East, and what does this mean for Africa, and how is Asia involved in this, and where were the Asian civilizations, where did they spring from, how are they affecting us, and how can there be justice across the planet? Okay, we are the world we are. Now, how do we so-called develop? Or how is the word development even not applicable anymore? How, even our semantics over the course of that year changed, such that we were always looking to develop, meaning to grow, to change, to see what are the new ways of thinking about this? How can we really contribute? Not just contribute in a token way, which will leave us dissatisfied and actually exacerbate the kind of global problem that we were facing. We were looking at those kind of problems about poverty alleviation, or we were looking at hunger, we were looking at infrastructure, transport, who has the trade, who has the resources, why aren't they equitably distributed, what can be done about this, the haves and have-nots, and the equality of it all. So when you've spent, and we got there after, we were at least 21. We got there after like 2 decades of having been exploring and educating ourselves. And in my case, actually, I'd already started work. I was actually working, freelancing at the BBC at the time. So I would attend Bush House in the evenings, attend lectures in the day at the LSE. So even before getting there, we were forming these opinions, but more importantly, we were questioning our opinions. And then at the LSE, we were testing those. And then I used to test them further through journalism in the evenings. So it was this really incredible breeding ground. And of course, the values compass would come from a ground like that. Of course, I would be doing a real disservice to everyone that had contributed to me, or all the discussions we'd ever had, or all that had taken place and then went on to take place for the 20 years after. So I had to bring it back to our foundation. This was inevitable.
And when you wrote this book, did you travel around and interview how did that happen? How did you gather the information that became part of this book?
Yes, so I was a journalist before we even met, and continued to. Journalism has always and will always be a third of my career, at least a part of my career. And so whether it was for the World Service, most recently I've been writing articles for CNN, I have a column on Forbes, as you rightly mentioned, Reuters and Thrive Global, various media outlets. And my interest has always been, I guess, development. International development is kind of like where I would say my values lie, or where it was the problem we were trying to solve, or what we were really felt was our kind of calling in life. So obviously there was a lot of travel involved. Any story, it was for the World Service, any story you're doing, you're thinking, how can this be of meaning or interest to a businessman in Japan and a grandma in Rwanda? Or how can it be applicable to all of the world because it's the most listened to radio? And if anything, the world has become only smaller and more interconnected over the last 20 years, and especially in the last year. So I would travel for the journalism, and then interview all kinds of people, from prime ministers and presidents to designers and shoe cleaners and artists and chocolate makers, you name it. Most importantly, I think, to be a fly on the wall and observe, read about places' history, but then experience their geography, live in the society and stand in their shoes to observe the psychology. So there were so many different aspects that naturally happen when you spend time in a place absorb and be absorbed by a place and are willing to be open, available, listen, and talk, share, communicate.
In your book, you take 101 values and you categorize them into 5 different categories of values. Within these categories, you attribute a particular value to a particular country. How did you make that determination?
I never went from the value perspective. I didn't say, okay, which is the most grateful nation on earth? No, I went from the what have I seen here? What makes people tick? What do people really value here? Um, what is their overriding concern or joy or source of pride? How has this? How have these people evolved? What's most important to them, and there emerges the value that they prize the most.
Talking about values is a very intimate thing. And I'm wondering what skills as a journalist you needed in order to have people open up and talk to you about their values.
So it's funny, Tanya. I don't think never really interviewed deliberately upon values. Um, I would definitely. I was very much like you are being now, giving a lot of space, listening, and how often do you think people give themselves the time and space to talk, to listen? I remember once, very recently, actually, just last month, I was in Mali in Western Africa. And I thought it really struck me that there was either this naivety or a great sense of personal pride or pride, but people didn't necessarily reduce their prices ever. Like it didn't matter if they were in need or not in need, or if the next door markets were selling anything for more or less, they stuck to their price. And I thought, how is it that micro and macro economic theory is not working in this country? What is happening here? And then I began to realize that people really didn't. If they earned an extra 100,000, 10,000, it wasn't going to necessarily dramatically change their lives because what they were valuing was time. I think someone even said to me, it's amazing, Deep, you're wearing the watch and yet we have the time. And actually, after that, I stopped wearing the watch because what they valued was being like sharing a cup of tea and having time to really talk to one another and having that space to shoot the breeze, I would say, or to really connect and listen and be heard, be seen. It is a rare, very precious and rare thing, and that's why it's being so prized. And when you're speaking to someone, you could call it an interview, you could call it a conversation, but when you really have this time and space that you're giving me now, it is rare. It is rare because in our day-to-day lives, we will say something as repetitive as "How are you?" and the other person will reply, "I'm fine." Neither of them are really asking the question properly or answering properly or giving it any thought or wanting to spend any time on it. So I think this one space, time, ears, interest, but really acute listening where you're able to reflect what they've said and then take it a step further so that you're almost building as you're going along and reflecting back to them something perhaps even they haven't noticed, just from how you've heard it or what you've heard or how, yeah, it's kind of like this sparring act where you're taking one another higher and further and deeper and with greater breadth and depth with each interaction.
Yeah, I think we often focus on the storyteller when we talk about storytelling, but storytelling is really a collaborative effort there's the person who's telling, there's the person who's listening, and like you said, there's this story that emerges that was not, in a lot of cultures, when you tell a story, it changes with every telling.
Yes. Yeah, maybe it embellishes with every telling, but that's okay. Or it will change, or it will become more and more informed.
Absolutely. Before we started our conversation today, I did mention that I have both the paperback version of your book and the audiobook. And for me, it was a particular delight to listen to the audiobook because it's read by you. And I love being told stories. And so if the audience enjoys listening, then I think they would really enjoy listening to your audiobook. What struck me about the book was that it wasn't just a story about cultures and the countries and their particular values, but it was also your story very much as the lived experience of these values as you journeyed through your life. I know that some of the audience members are not going to have a chance to travel to these 101 countries, but the values still are relevant to them. So, in what way do you think the audience members can take this book and use it in their own life?
Well, there's two or three very distinct ways. But before I get there, I'm just curious to ask, is there one or two or three stories that really struck you or will stay with you or surprised you or delighted you?
Well, the one about our LSE colleague and how you admired her so much when she got up on the stage and she was very nervous about speaking, but she had come across with such confidence. That one, because it's personal, I knew the person you were talking about. That really was a cherished story. I think one where you you seem to injure yourself a few times through the book, but there was one time where you were injured for several days and had to be you had to walk out um, to find medical help. And I just thought, wow, I didn't know that about you, that you had been through such adversity in your travels. So these were the kind of stories that struck me as really evocative. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because uh, uh, I I'm just as healthy or as unhealthy as the next person, but the reason that the adversities come up again and again, um, or the injuries, or however you call it, and actually there've been more that you haven't even got to the book, because actually that's where you grow, or that's where the lessons are, or that's much more interesting than things going well, or plain sailing, so to speak. So even though at the time you, however you think, however badly it's going or however it's going, in the end it actually creates a great story. And I think this is help me answer your question, because in each vignette or story, they're just 2-3 pages long. In each of them, my aim is to take you into a country through some experience so that you can put yourself into my shoes or any shoes that you're taken in through a story that actually happened. And it could easily have been you on those rocks in Melbourne, you know, with the sea suddenly turning so strong that you're washed off that rock, your face hits the rock, your glasses break, there's blood everywhere. You don't realize it, but your nose has totally just broken, it's snapped. Your arm has snapped out of, you are now completely injured, but you have no idea because all you can see is blood and you can't even see because your glasses are broken and you're wearing glasses. So you know how that feels when you're literally just kind of feeling your way out of this rocky, muddy path and you have no idea how you're going to get out of this, or indeed what's happened or what's about to happen next or how you're going to survive. Now, in that circumstance, that's to get you there very immediately. What happens in a country that prizes mateship, that kind of look after one another? And we're speaking about Australia, where they've even have this term mateship. And then what would it mean for you to have this element of mateship in your life. If you made it a priority, what would that mean for you? And so within those 2 to 3 pages, I take you into that country, I show you how it works within that country, and then I take you into your own life and have you question what would it mean for you to make that a priority. So immediately, the whole book has been written for you as a reader to think about the applicability of these values within your life practically. And then it takes one step or several steps further by taking you through a process, so that you've had some time to reflect on those values, and then it takes you through a process to really ascertain your core values by asking you key questions, by kind of cutting out the lies that you tell yourself, or cutting out the subtle excuses that you normally have, or cutting out whatever's happening in your subconscious, so that you really get to what's driving you, or what you wish was important, or what you really aspire for. And then once it's kind of whittled down and got to your kind of top 5, then you go through a process of creating a priority list of your top 5. And that's really important, because if everything is equally important, it's really hard, because you're back at square one. You might as well not have done it, because you're, all 5 of the 5 that you've chosen, if they're all at the same level, then when you're making decisions, you're torn again. But by having a process that makes you create a priority list, you're then able to say, well, I'm going to make this number 1 until I've really met this, and until this has truly been satisfied or fulfilled. And then it can either drop off the list or become number 5, but normally it drops off the list and you've got a different number 1. And as you do that, you find that then the way you're making decisions is, one, aligned to what's important to you, not to your peers and not to your family and not to your society, but to you. And more importantly, is going to lead to greater harmony, because it's coming out of what you think is important. You're able to communicate it better, so there's harmony around you. And you make decisions with ease and impact, so that you're walking into a life or into a story or into a legacy that you truly want to be leaving, or that truly is of value or importance to you. So the book has really been written for you. And I've just utilized the world as a colourful way to take you around the values. It could have been a academic textbook, and you probably wouldn't be saying it's an international bestseller, and nor would you be that interested. Or it could be a memoir, but why is that of interest? I think my whole aim was to just think, why could this be important to you? How could this be of value to you? How could it serve you, so that you're leading your very best life?
Wonderful. So, I think we all have this intuitive sense of what's important to us, but you really advocate narrowing it down to 5 values. And that seems really small when you're starting with 101.
So 5 are important because too many will be just overwhelming and potentially lack focus, and you just wouldn't remember many more. If I asked you to remember 7 or 10 or 12 or 15, I don't think you would, and I don't think it would lose its power and it wouldn't work.
Right.
But too few, if it was just 1 or 2, I think you're wider than that. You have greater interest than that. You want greater balance than just a few. So focus is important, but balance is also important. And so 5 is a good number, because it really, it's not just something I picked out of the air. Actually, it's tried and tested and proven time and time again, to be effective, to be able to be enough to create balance, but focused enough to create an impact. Values are definitely a combination of nature and nurture and choice. As we grow older, we realize we can choose them. Often you feel as though you're being driven by them before it becomes an active choice, or that you are just reacting to them. They're just knee-jerk reactions. So when you make a deliberate active choice, then it is indeed up to you as to whether you evolve or these are core values that will never change. And so it depends on how you utilize. This process can be utilized in many different ways. For some people, it will be to reach goals or objectives or to be very aspirational. For some people, it will be about being really true to themselves. And these are kind of tried and tested and time-bound values that, for example, integrity or justice. It doesn't matter what happens, that is the most important, maybe the most important thing to you. So you realize actually you could do 2 or 3 different processes for different junctures in life also. What I encourage is that you set a time period. So let's say for the next year, or until you change jobs, or until whilst you're still with young children, or whilst you're looking after your sick parents, or whilst you're living in this particular town, or whatever that period be, however you define it, you give yourself a period and do the process for that period. And then afterwards, when either that context has changed or that objective has been met, you made the promotion, or your children are now old enough, or your parent is well, or your health is better, whatever, again, the context be, when that changes, to reshuffle, rethink, do the process again. And it doesn't take long, but it's most definitely worth revisiting, because you will find naturally that some things have become so ingrained in you that they're habits, and that you no longer have to emphasize or prioritize or focus on them, because they're just the way you live now. So it gives space, makes space for the next.
Make space for the next. As I ask with everybody, I need to ask you, as a storyteller, for what are you most grateful?
I love that question. It's not because I've written a book about values, but values are what I'm grateful for, like compassion, like my values of freedom. I'm really grateful for the freedoms that we have. My values of family. I can't even tell you how grateful I am for family, especially now when their vulnerability is so paramount and so clear. I value growth and service, and either the opportunities to grow and serve, and just the joy that it brings, or like to be able to, if we come from a place of service, it doesn't matter what we're experiencing in life, you can then, I was going to say, handle it. You can embrace it, because you see it as, okay, how am I growing through this experience? How is my soul evolving? How, there is beauty in this. Show me the beauty and the grace, but much more importantly, let me grow in that beauty or grace. And I'm grateful for health. We've lived our life for the last few years with health being front and center, not opening our front doors, or, because of protecting our health and protecting others. But yet we should be valuing, and can be valuing, and do value our health in everything we do, in how we move, in what we eat, in the food, in the medicine. Food is medicine, in everything, in what we say to ourselves, the words we use, the thoughts, the deeds, the actions. All of this is all fundamentally either building our health or deteriorating our health. So no matter how people are answering this gratitude question, I would strip it down to values, because I could probably see the values with which they're answering.
I would also add that if anybody wants to see an exercise in expressing gratitude, that the acknowledgments in your book almost made me cry. It was so beautifully written. I want to thank you, Mandeep, for being with us today and sharing about storytelling and about values with our audience.
Actually, all the gratitude is mine, and I almost feel like the time we've spent together is too short because there are so many stories, and to be honest, I'd love to do this interview again, but interviewing you. So let's discuss that. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you. I want to turn it over now to the audience. And one of the exercises that Mandeep talks about in her book is writing your own eulogy. And if you could write your own eulogy, what values would you want to see represented by the things that people say about you? If you like this video and you want to see more in the Storytellers series, then click subscribe. If you hit the bell icon, you'll be notified when we upload again. For what are you most grateful today?